Welcome, Shannon Gales Protenus. I will be your moderator today. So that things run smoothly, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. The lines will stay muted for the duration of the call. If you have a question, you can utilize the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer questions at the end of the webinar. Our presenters today are David Holtzman of CynergisTek and Robert Lord of Protenus. David Holtzman is an executive advisor at CynergisTek, which has been recognized by class as a top-performing firm in healthcare cybersecurity. He is a subject matter expert in health information privacy policy and compliance issues involving data protection and breach notification standards. David is experienced in developing, implementing, and evaluating health information privacy and security compliance programs. He is also a former senior advisor for health information technology and the HIPAA Security Rule, Office for Civil Rights. Robert Lord is the co-founder and president of Protenus, an analytics platform that leverages artificial intelligence to detect data breaches in healthcare. Protenus protects the nation's top healthcare systems, ensuring trust for tens of millions of patients, and was named the 2019 Best-in-Class Category Leader in Privacy Monitoring. Thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar, and without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Robert.
Thanks so much, Shannon, for the kind introduction, and thank you to David for joining us here today.
And thank you for inviting me.
It's always my pleasure to co-present with David. We do this every once in a while because, in particular, not only is David terrific, but he actually knows what he's talking about, unlike me. So you'll actually get some value out of this, I hope. I'm super excited about that.
My head is swelling.
So, as you all know, we have a rather fanciful title for this one. I think it's about Facebook and APIs and Equifax and all sorts of fun things. But I think when we distill what we're talking about today, it's about what big changes are people talking about when it comes to healthcare privacy. And then really importantly, how do you take all of that? How do you look at all of these different acronyms and judgments and trends and separate out the signal from the noise? What is it that privacy professionals in healthcare really need to be focusing on, and what matters? To that end, let's talk a little bit about the acronyms we are proverbially inviting to this webinar party here. We're going to kick things off with a discussion around HIPAA and really the enforcement trends that have been occurring there, what's relevant on that front. GDPR is on everyone's mind lately. We'll briefly touch on that. We'll talk a little bit about CCPA, actually what CCPA suggests more broadly about U.S. enforcement. And then we'll move into some of the interesting precedents set by Facebook and Equifax decisions lately. As we move into kind of the second half, conceptually, of what we're talking about, we're going to start to move into some of the emerging technologies and emerging judgments around APIs and interoperability more broadly. And then finally, we'll close up with a discussion of artificial intelligence and machine learning. The buzzwords we could probably absolutely stick on, but are still representing trends that we need to take a look at. So, with that, it's a lot going on, but interestingly, I hope you see by the end that it all connects and it all paints a very cohesive picture of where things are going when it comes to privacy and security. Let's start with some data. We love data here at CynergisTek. If you're taking a look at OCR's average, now some observers might take a look at the fact that actually there's been kind of an overall increase in OCR fines over the last couple of years. But that number has gone down this year. Now, okay, does this paint a picture of similar enforcement? Does it paint a picture of maybe slightly increasing enforcement? It's a bit more complex. When we look at total fines, the picture is rather different, right? This is a little bit more up and down, and then this year, very, very down. Now, for those of you who might be thinking, I've got to take a look at the overall picture of last year we had massive enforcement in the last quarter of the year, that type of thing. Maybe that's the story. I think David will have some thoughts on that. And then when you look at number of fines, also you can see this significant diminishment. David, what do you think is going on when it comes to OCR and enforcement?
Well, I think we're seeing a couple of trends come to fruition. The first is the department's overall approach to reduce burden on healthcare organizations and healthcare providers. And I think the second issue is OCR's changed approach to enforcement to rely more on voluntary corrective action, as well as to conduct fewer or open fewer full investigations by providing technical assistance letters, which are essentially closures with a slap on the wrist. The other key issue you may have noticed earlier this year is that OCR used its enforcement discretion into reducing the penalty amounts that it would apply based on culpability, as well as to modify the culpability levels under the interpreting the enforcement rule.
Yeah. So overall, it seems like there's a picture of, when it comes to privacy, perhaps a slightly or very less active OCR on this front.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure there's any diminishment in activity, because we still have those investigators who are in the regional offices working day after day to review reports of breaches that are coming in, as well as an increased emphasis on patient access to their own information. But we'll dive deeper into that topic later on.
Yeah. So it almost is like there's a center of gravity shift a little as we think about things outside of OCR, perhaps defining a little bit more of what a privacy posture should look like. We've talked about, are things less stringent going forward? I think you kind of answered that question with, well, it's actually that enforcement's changing to a little bit of a different direction. And then ultimately, we might be looking at other regulations as well on this front. So why don't we start with a little bit around GDPR to begin? That's one that I think everyone's sort of asking. I know I can say from my interactions, a lot of people are saying, hey, Robert, how do you think GDPR is going to be impacting us as health systems?
Well, I think GDPR is having a significant influence on both policymakers and consumers. So GDPR has been in force for 15 months. They've collected well over 260 million euros in fines and penalties. They have hundreds of cases that they are either investigating or that they have resolved. And around the world, larger organizations are registering the appropriate officials that are required under GDPR. I think the impact here in the U.S. is a little bit more sophisticated. Larger organizations, especially those that are contractors or vendors to healthcare organizations, they're having to weigh whether they want to have two compliance programs or a compliance program for every country they're doing business in, or having a single compliance program. For healthcare organizations, it's a little bit more cut and dry. If you're involved in research, or you're in like a research institution or an AMC, or you're recruiting patients from the EU, or you're hiring healthcare professionals to work in your facilities, whether they be in the U.S. or they be overseas, you're more likely to be impacted in needing to comply with GDPR. But we still hear from healthcare organizations around the country who are confused by the requirements of GDPR, because from time to time they will treat a patient who's a citizen of the European Union. But just as importantly, GDPR is serving as sort of a template for both policymakers and for consumers, because consumers are looking at the headlines of how the EU and the UK are enforcing GDPR and the rights that are provided under GDPR, and they're asking themselves, why not here? Why don't we have these protections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I like this kind of general approach that I think is slowly occurring, which is, before we had this highly prescriptive, and we'll talk about this more, we had this highly prescriptive set of checkboxes that we knew we needed to meet. But this is really forcing us, I think, as a nation to start thinking about, well, what's just the right thing to do? When we look at who's leading the way globally, what are they doing? And I think that's a really healthy conversation for us to have. It's also a conversation that has somewhat catalyzed our next topic, which is the CCPA. Briefly, for those of you who aren't familiar with the CCPA, it's a somewhat complex piece of legislation, but I think there's 4 kind of core components you could think about. First, it's the right to know what information has been collected by an entity that's not a covered entity, but an entity that is covered by CCPA. Next, it's the ability to opt out of that organization's ability to sell your data, so you should have that kind of control in place. the right, of course, to delete information that's held by any entity. And then finally, that anti-discrimination right. So even if you're not going to provide information, that isn't used as a penalty against you. Whether that's different types of insurance or care or lots of other potential penalties. But David, tell us a little bit more about this. You've been dealing, I know, a lot with these CCPA questions.
So CCPA is the poster child for a California legislature gone wild. But there's two key takeaways that organizations have to keep in mind. The first is that it only applies to certain for-profit organizations. So if you're a for-profit organization, it's vital that you look at CCPA and understand if you're in scope of that consumer protection and consumer privacy legislation. The second key takeaway is that unlike the approach we take in all the other states here in the U.S., it is a holistic approach, more like the GDPR in influence, because it's a holistic consumers having a fundamental right of privacy and control of knowing what information is collected about them and how and choices that they can make in using and disclosing it.
Yeah. So why don't we take a look next at how you figure out even if this applies to you?
Sure. So under the CCPA, only businesses that are for profit and have a gross revenue of $25 million or more are subject to CCPA, or they are purely data brokers, or they have a digital presence in which they are handling the California definition of personally identifiable information in a digital approach of 50,000 California consumers or more.
Yeah.
But one of the key takeaways for healthcare organizations, even for for-profit healthcare organizations, or the contractors and vendors who are handling the personally identifiable information of being based in California and handling California residents' information, is the large exemption that organizations who are subject to HIPAA, either as a covered entity or business associate or California's own brand HIPAA, the CMIA, the California Medical Information Act, these organizations are either largely exempt or through their actions in complying with the HIPAA privacy and security and breach notification rules, they can be wholly exempt from the provisions of CCPA. So CCPA has a large write-out in exemption, and the key takeaway from that is if you protect all of the personally identifiable information that you maintain, not just your HIPAA covered information, but information that you gain through a digital presence or through interaction with your employees and contractors. If you protect that information the same way you protect your PHI, you are almost entirely exempt from the requirements of CCPA. So as we see with the next slide, the CCPA is evolving. So while CCPA takes effect on January 1st, and enforcement is expected to take effect on July 1st, 2020, some of the provisions of CCPA are still being developed as we speak today. So just last week, the California legislature, as it ended its session for the 2019 year, it created two big exemptions for organizations subject to CCPA. One is to exempt the personal information of employees, their family members, and the emergency contacts, as well as job applicants, are wholly exempt from the consumer protection provisions of CCPA, but only for 1 year. And the same 1 year moratorium is being applied, an exemption for information that's created or maintained about consumers in relation to business transactions.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing, in this last bullet point here that I think about is CCPA is kind of fascinating as a thought-provoking and also practically action-provoking type of piece of legislation. Because on one end, you've got the fact that if you have California citizens or operate in California as a kind of cross-nation organization, then you really have to look into, does this apply to you? But then even more broadly, that kind of unique, holistic approach that it's taking is also spurring action of either other states or organizations to start wondering, again, much like with GDPR, what's the right thing to do here? Whatever we might be individually subject to at this exact moment, what's the right thing to do, and where's the ball going, right? And I think that kind of brings us to the bottom line, at least as I see it, right? This center of gravity is in many, many ways shifting from a federal enforcement type of regime to exactly the same or perhaps even more stringent standards, but really being looked at from the state level. And I'm curious, how are you seeing this in your daily interactions, David?
So I see this as consumers influencing their state legislators and regulators in reaction to the large breach incidents that have exposed almost every American to the unauthorized disclosure of their personally identifiable information. This is much bigger than just healthcare, and I think I think at the end of the day, we're going to see the largest states that have the most significant influence. In other words, places where most of the Fortune 1000 are doing business. Mm-hmm. They're going to have requirements for both protecting personally identifiable information, as well as specific information security or cybersecurity programs required for any organization, profit or nonprofit, that maintains the sensitive, non-public information of a consumer.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. We note here Indiana, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Washington have been very aggressive. Are you seeing any other trends nationally on this front?
Well, I've had the privilege of spending some time in Colorado and Illinois recently. Mm. Illinois, I think we talk about attorney generals in Illinois, where a private right of action has been created, and there are specific laws protecting biometric information.
That's an interesting one.
Employees of large grocery and other retailer chains are suing and winning cases against their employers because they have failed to follow Illinois' brand of biometric information protection requirements. And I think that is a trend that we're going to see. I think another trend we're going to see are the data protections provided for in states where medical marijuana is permitted, because one key common factor in medical marijuana states is the state-issued identification card. Right. And if you look at the 53 or 54 different state and territorial laws which protect information, then what you will see is a protection of state-issued ID cards. Mm-hmm. I'm so sorry. We're going to get rid of that.
That must just be the alarm that we're hitting maximum possible insight to be extracted from this particular slide. So one of the things that kind of comes from looking at all of this is you're starting to really see this common law duty emerge to use reasonable safeguards. I think that's kind of a clear thread that's coming through a lot of it. But we have a lot of individuals say, okay, well, I'm using reasonable safeguards. I'm auditing appropriately. I think I'm finding everything that is to be found. Surprisingly, I do still hear that from time to time. And so I thought I'd share a statistic that comes from Protenus' research group that might be interesting for individuals. One of the things that we do is we take a look at what is the true scope of the number of violations that occurs inside a health system. And we've developed this interesting ratio. So it's 1 to 300. For every 300 employees, that you have at a health system, you can expect 1 privacy violation per month. So that means if you're a 30,000 employee organization, you can expect roughly 1,200 privacy violations per year. Most organizations that we've seen are really not detecting at that scope. And so as we have this kind of more state-focused enforcement, as we have a more risk-based rather than checkbox-based kind of approach, would encourage organizations to benchmark against this type of number and say, how good a job are we really doing here? How much more do we have to go? Because ultimately, this field is pushing forward. And the further we're getting from really understanding this true value, the more risk that you're accruing, perhaps, unfortunately, quite silently. And I think this gets to that core area of how do you move from a more risk-based to a more, how do you move to a more risk-based paradigm from a more checkbox-based paradigm before? And there's a couple of key things that we certainly see. So one is that there's much more movement towards proactive solutions on this front. So less retroactive kind of reporting, taking a look at it, and more saying, okay, what are the risks I need to be focusing on right now, just in time? I think there's another that's kind of getting beyond the fear of, okay, let's just look at the tip of the iceberg because we got a lot more going on beneath the surface, and institutionally having that willingness to say, we've got to tackle this problem because it's basically this continuous danger that's getting worse and worse every year. I think there's another big piece here that comes from the fact that it's focused not just on finding, but actually reducing risk, right? So we also see that what you want to do is say, for each of the violations you're detecting, what are the characteristics of it? Where are they occurring in my organization? What are the characteristics of the people who are committing these violations? And can we target education or other interventions or controls to improve things? And then finally, and I think this is really hit home by that 1 in 300 ratio, how do we make sure we're reviewing everything? Because very few organizations right now are reviewing 100% of all of the activities, all of the accesses to patient data in the health system. And while we see that a massively increasing proportion, there's still a lot of work to do across the country. David, I'm curious about your thoughts on this sort of paradigmatic shift. Anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, I think we're certainly seeing a more effective approach to managing personally identifiable information. You and I disagree a little bit on the scope.
On all sorts of things.
Yes,
that's the basis of our friendship.
Yes,
really.
I know. But I look at the iceberg as being all personally identifiable information, and organizations, as we are seeing through the adoption of these paradigm shifting holistic approaches to empowering consumers to manage their own data. They all have one thing in common, and that is the requirement to be able to manage and monitor the activity around a consumer's information. And it's not limited to their health information. It's related to any non-public information that the organization is maintaining. But a part of that paradigm shift is also the ability not just to recognize that these activities are taking place, not just to detect that these incidents are taking place, but to take action, to follow up, to investigate. That's one of the key, for a number of years, that's been one of the key attributes of the HIPAA privacy and breach notification rules, the affirmative obligation to follow up on incidents that are taking place. But we're seeing that now carried over into these broader privacy and consumer empowerment programs, and also here in the U.S. the sector-specific cybersecurity program requirements that thou shalt detect and investigate these types of incidents.
No, I mean, I couldn't agree more. A lot of times we think about, well, am I auditing? Am I detecting? But at the end of the day, it really is about getting biased towards action as an organization, right? What are you really doing once you find someone? And then measuring meaningfully, did the action you take kind of systematically change the way you're doing things too? There's so many lessons to be learned every time, I think. Never waste a crisis, right? Everyone's an opportunity. And I think that There's a lot of opportunities right now that we miss, not because people don't want to or because they're lazy or anything like that. I mean, I've never seen probably more hardworking group of individuals than privacy and security professionals in healthcare. But what we do see is that they're just massively overburdened in so many cases. It's very difficult to focus on some of that culture change sometimes when you've got to sift through all this information all the time.
And I think that's important. I think that's an important point. It's a culture change, not at the level of the chief privacy officer or chief information security officer. They get it. Mm-hmm. It's the culture change that's necessary at the board of directors and at the executives.
Yeah.
It's not so much that they have to get it, but they have to respect it, acknowledge it, and empower the folks who are responsible for safeguarding their most valuable asset, their consumers' personal identifiable information.
Yeah, well said. Moving on a little bit to our next topic, let's talk a little bit about those interesting Facebook and Equifax cases. I was lucky to be able to find this rather troubling and appropriate image. Let's start with Facebook. So, David, could you give us a little background on this? I found this pretty interesting the more I dug into it.
Sure. So Facebook has found itself in a world of trouble, but but I think for our purposes, let's just talk about a little quarter of Facebook's troubled world, and that is about the groups and the implied promises, pardon me, that were made to these folks who started health groups as a means to have a community for those who were dealing with either themselves or through their family members with specific diseases or conditions, and and Facebook was a valuable opportunity for to share both questions, concerns, and seek support, as well as to develop communities for research. So the Facebook led these health group members and the sponsors of these health groups to believe that their groups and the sensitive information that they'd be posting to these groups would be either anonymized or that the member lists would be kept separate and only available to those who had been given entry or membership into these groups. Yeah. It turned out that Facebook was in fact sharing this data with its marketing partners and was releasing this data to third parties, and oftentimes they would release it to fourth parties. Mm-hmm. So the information was not confidential, and in fact, the individual posts could be tied to individual members. And so these folks were receiving marketing queries from the large ad technology organizations specific to their disease type, and was also available for use and cataloged in larger information databases that could be used by insurers and employers. It was extremely disturbing.
What do you think the big takeaway is for health systems and other individuals and kind of healthcare privacy specifically when it comes to this judgment?
Well, I think it's important to be clear in keeping in making and keeping promises to your consumers. I mean, Facebook has lost all kinds of credibility. I mean, we don't need to dive down deep into that. Although it was troubling that the recent Federal Trade Commission settlement with Facebook did not address the health groups issue.
Yeah, I was surprised by that.
However, to their credit, and begrudgingly, we must give credit to Facebook for changing its approach to the group health program. Yeah. But there are still there are important advocacy groups that continue to push the Federal Trade Commission to expand the settlement agreement with Facebook, to hold their feet to the fire and make them accountable not just for these voluntary changes to their approach to the confidentiality for these health groups, but to make it a part of their corrective action plan.
Yeah, no, great point. So Facebook's definitely one thing we've seen in the news. Another one is Equifax.
So, I think the big, while many folks are shocked by the size and the scope and the severity of what happened at Equifax, to many it really is just another lesson of an organization that did not pay attention to how it designed and implemented basic information security practices around the sensitive consumer information that it was creating or maintaining. And in addition to not having appropriate safeguards, once the hacker was able to get access to the network and to the data that was being stored, it went undetected for months before Equifax took action. Now there seems to be some controversy and some continued investigation as to whether Equifax was aware and had detected the intrusion and failed to take action, or whether they whether in fact it had gone undetected. But that's neither here nor there for the impacted consumers. And the Federal Trade Commission, in their review, seems to be focusing on the lack of controls. And basic controls it had already highlighted in its reasonable security practices for organizations that handle consumer information.
Well, one big takeaway that I got from this was looking at that 10 weeks of an internal threat undetected. I compared that a little bit to some of the research that Protenus does on our breach barometer, which is a free resource, by the way. If you're interested in it, we regularly publish statistics on what's going on in health data breaches. It's completely free. We won't spam you. It's just a piece of research that we put out. You can Google Protenus breach barometer to get a hold of it. But in that, one of the things that we track is how long threats go undetected in healthcare. And I will say, if the FTC ends up continuing this focus on a lack of controls on these sorts of internal monitoring, healthcare is a heck of a lot worse on average than 10 weeks. Threats go, I believe, undetected for usually months on average when it's in a health system. And that is a pretty bad state to be in. So I think it's something that's definitely worth considering on the horizon.
And we've already seen examples of that type of incident take place. So, for example, the Anthem healthcare breach, where the intruder went undetected the flaw went undetected for months while a law firm was gathering its own data of the failure of Anthem's health insurance application system to appropriately detect that data was being, the URL was being manipulated to allow people access, unauthorized access to other people's applications. Another example, near and dear to my heart, are my friends at Memorial Healthcare System in Florida, where some lax controls allowed for users to gain access to accounts that should have been terminated, but it took place over a long period of time, and now they have appropriate detection systems in place, and if it happened today, they would be able to detect that this unauthorized access, network access, was taking place.
So to kind of close up this section on this regulatory landscape, let's talk a little bit about some guideposts that people can use to maybe navigate what is a rather uncertain environment with a lot of not contradictory, but simply different areas of focus for different regulators.
So, it's really interesting. Here in the U.S., unique in North America, we have a patchwork approach to both data protection and privacy and security requirements. So there is no one-size-fits-all definition of what is a reasonable, what are the reasonable security practices. But here are some guides as to where you can go. You can go to the CISA 405D Health Sector Coordinating Council document that was released almost a year ago called Five Threats and 10 Solutions or 10 Best Practices. The Federal Trade Commission has a series of publications designed to help organizations identify what are the reasonable best information security practices. And the National Association of Insurance Commissioners has developed a model law for the insurance industry that has been adopted in 8 or 9 states that provide clear direction as to the steps that an organization must take to have a responsible information security program.
Yeah. The great thing is, there are a lot of resources out there. There's many good guides, many good supports. And I think a theme that we'll talk about throughout is it's all about how do you look a little bit ahead of the curve? How do you really reduce your risks? How do you think about it a little bit more holistically? Because in many ways, our enforcement authorities are figuring out just as the practitioners are. So we talked a little bit about the current and likely future regulatory landscape and what's relevant, what's not relevant. What we want to talk a little bit about next is some of the emerging technologies in these spaces, or the ones that have already very much emerged, and what they mean for your organization. Let's start with the topic of APIs, or Application Programming Interfaces. Now, APIs, and I'll go into a little more detail, but I always think about them as bridges between two systems that allow for the exchange or access to information. So that's a very simple metaphor, but let's go into a little bit more detail. So essentially, the way an API works is it serves as an intermediary between a variety of different types of data and databases and a client. So what can occur in a model like this, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is basically a client of any sort. So this could be an app that focused, in the case of healthcare, on healthcare data. That app would send a request to an API. It would be built into the app in many ways, but the API is external to it. The API would then translate that request back to a database. Perhaps that database is owned by a health system or another provider of health data or a collector of health data in some way. And that database gets that data from a variety of different sources across that organization. You can think about it as if you're at a health system, your data warehouse, perhaps, is a pretty good analogy. So that API conceptually is this mediating rules system that happens between that internal protected data warehouse and that external organization or product that wants to access that data somehow. It serves as a kind of rules layer, a formatting layer, and an access layer. Now, the reason why we're talking about this relatively technical topic is that the challenge of APIs in healthcare has become rather significant and is one that health systems are pretty continuously asking us about, especially in the last 2 years. I've seen a massive increase in kind of API implementation and protection of data questions. And it's not surprising because if you look at HIM surveys on this front, over half of organizations are strongly considering or actively working on APIs. And those that aren't really haven't even thought about it at all and probably have actually several different implementations of these. The key thing to think about with an API is it is a mechanism by which the outside world can access some portion of your data. And in many cases, if you don't have an overall strategy associated with it, it may be happening in ways that you're not aware of or are much less controlled. It might be, especially if you're a research institution, potentially mediated by separate research protocols or other mechanisms. And so we wanted to briefly discuss some of the components that might help you get a little bit more strategic around APIs. I guess, let me push it over to you a little, David. How do you think about the kind of current landscape of APIs as it relates to our privacy regulatory landscape?
So I think of it in two ways. Using your bridge analogy, we don't have lines painted on the surface of the bridge. Mm-hmm. So there are no security standards for API, and currently through the proposed rules by Office of National Coordinator and CMS, which will require healthcare organizations to allow consumers to use APIs to gain access to their information. They're just now developing the standards, the voluntary standards by which these APIs can operate. But so there are some very loose rules to the road, which creates a dilemma for organizations that are having to accept access through these APIs. How do they identify the good API from the bad API, the API that has malware or some other exploit loaded into it?
Yeah.
Secondly, how will they assure that they can verify that the patient has actually initiated the request through the API?
Yeah.
The second way I look at this is not just on the bridge, but on the two landings, the pieces of land that are used to approach the bridge. Because once that health information that comes from an insurer, a payer, or a healthcare provider that's subject to HIPAA, once that information passes through the toll booths at each end of the bridge, it's no longer subject to the protections of HIPAA.
Yeah.
And the patient information, once it's downloaded onto the smartphone application or other internet-based application that the consumer is using to handle that data, it's no longer protected by HIPAA or most other federal regulation.
So, this actually brings up another really interesting question, because at the core of all of these APIs and interoperability is also this question of data sharing and access to patient information. And there was a very recent type of fine that just came through by OCR that I'd love to get your thoughts on, because there's still a lot of discussion going on here on what the real implications are.
So from where I sit, this is OCR's first enforcement action regarding its most recent approach to promote patient access to their information. The privacy rule, since its implementation in 2003, has guaranteed patients access to their information and has set standards for how healthcare organizations must respond to patients' requests for their information in a timely manner and at a charge that's reasonably based on providing access to the information. So what's happened here is that after 16 years of the HIPAA privacy rule and many thousands, tens of thousands of complaints from individuals about their inability to access their information, we see OCR making an example of an organization that failed to live up to the requirements of the HIPAA rule because they failed to provide a patient a copy of their information as had been requested for over 9 months, and when it was requested in electronic format, they weren't able to honor or fulfill that request.
Yeah. No, there's a lot here, and I think we'll have to continue to look at this horizon. But all of these, both technological and regulatory changes, I think are really painting a picture of both a lot more possibility for clinical interoperability, which is a great thing on one hand, but also a vastly increased risk surface from a privacy and security perspective that we're going to have to be very vigilant about.
Yes, because under the proposed interoperability rules, healthcare organizations and insurers are going to have to provide real-time access to patients who are seeking their information.
Absolutely. So the last big trend that I want to take some time to discuss here is the rise of artificial intelligence and machine learning in healthcare, which are these kind of difficult buzzwords to really take a hold of and understand, but I think the trends are very clear. Taking a quick grab of investment in AI in healthcare, you can see that the trends are pretty inescapable. There's significantly more investment in this space, and this is just a look at private kind of venture and equity investment. It doesn't even go into the massive amounts of AI investment that are occurring throughout health systems in a variety of other contexts. And so a lot of times our clients ask us, well, what is artificial intelligence, right? How can I kind of explain this to my team? And so what I'd love to do is briefly talk about a couple of pop cultural examples that help illustrate the point of what AI is good at and what AI is very much not good at. So the classic example that people sometimes think about when they think about artificial intelligence is, of course, Skynet. Why not? The classic Terminator movies are a very good example of artificial intelligence gone badly awry, so they're often used as a poster child for things going very wrong if we apply it incorrectly. What this means in my mind, though, is people are very afraid of what I often think of as something called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. Artificial intelligence that can do pretty much any task. And the reality is, it's nowhere near this right now. We're very much in a stage where AI has to be focused in on very specific areas of expertise to be successful. And I think that that's something that should allay a lot of concerns around this. In the security and privacy context, the way that we see this is AI is rather unsuccessful when it's holistically replacing an entire set of jobs, but it can be very successful when you give it a specific type of application, like find privacy violations, or find network security violations, or help secure this particular type of machine. And so that's how I would encourage you to think about its capabilities in that front. Another area, and a very different example where people think about AI is, can it use human judgment? Now, I don't know how many of you have seen this movie, but essentially it's about a movie starring Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson, where a man falls in love with an artificial intelligence algorithm, more or less. And this is not to say that anyone's arguing that there's a romance story here, but fundamentally that AI can have compassion and human judgment, and it can think about human frailty and the grays of human behavior. And that's simply just another thing that AI cannot do well. As we all know in the privacy and security space, there's a huge amount of judgment calls that you have to make around personal motivations, around the subtleties of human behavior, around thinking through all of these implications moving forward. And that's a really critical element that you always are not going to be able to get with AI. But sometimes people also think of AI as completely incompetent. They think about AI as that first generation Siri, where you ask Siri, hey, can you find me directions to this restaurant? And Siri says, of course, ordering you a Domino's pizza right now. So it's not quite like that. Most of the time, AI, if given the right set of tools, techniques, and focus, is actually fully able to accomplish a significant swath of jobs. You just need to make sure, as we said earlier, that it's doing that really effectively. I actually like to think of something that we probably all use most days as one of the best examples of AI that applies to a privacy and security context. And that's Netflix. Netflix has one really simple job, and it does it incredibly well. I can easily say Netflix probably knows me better than any other person on earth, and it's not even a person, based on how accurately it predicts what I want to watch next. So Netflix is a highly focused algorithm, right? It's focused on figuring out what movies it should queue up for you. It does that incredibly well, and it does that still keeping a human in the middle of it, right? So it's never going to replace that whole process of figuring out what's going on from a security or privacy perspective, but it's going to give you exactly what you need just in time, and then you'll make that final choice as a professional in this field. So when you're thinking about what AI can do, I think the Netflix model is the one that makes the most sense and a good way to communicate it. So let's talk about one specific application, and the one that we're most familiar with here at Protenus, which is how can you understand all of those accesses to data that are occurring in your system every single day from a privacy monitoring perspective? Right now, your average system may look at hundreds of millions or billions of access events per month, but you probably are only able to run human audits on 1,000 or less, maybe 10,000. And this is a pretty clear type of picture of what that looks like. If you're in this situation in a day, you might have 10 million access to patient data, audit 1,000 if you had an incredibly diligent, dedicated person doing that. You're barely getting at anything, right? If you expand this out, let's have a magical fantasy scenario where suddenly you can hire 100 more auditors. Still, you can see it's not moving the needle. You're only looking at a tiny fraction. You're looking at a single % of these records, and you know that you're not going to find everything. Some organizations are thus deploying very different approaches to this challenge. They're saying, well, can I use AI to do the work of reviewing all of those accesses and understand them in much greater detail so I can focus on what's important? And the way that I often visualize it is, if you think about this challenge, you can look at it from the perspective of risk and suspicion. So if you look On one axis, you've got the riskiness of data. So that might be, for instance, sensitive psychiatric diagnoses, HIV positive records, things like that. And from suspiciousness, it's how abnormal is it, right? It might be very risky, but not suspicious, for instance, that an infectious disease doctor was looking at the record of an HIV positive patient they've been seeing for 20 years because the data is very sensitive, but it's very appropriate for them to be doing that. It might be very suspicious, but not risky, if there is an admin who just joined a couple of days ago who's looking at hundreds of different face sheets and addresses, but they're not looking at any sensitive clinical data. So it's not appropriate, but they are looking at a lot of information that they shouldn't be. So where you really want to focus your effort and what AI allows you to do is figure out what are those dots in red, right? It reviews everything, but it says, here's where I want you to take a look. And then, of course, that human still needs to be able to apply their judgment to do that well. And I think if you look at this graph and you say, what's the essence of how AI can add value? It's getting you to see what those red dots are in the upper right-hand corner and helping you focus in on that. But how do you determine, in a lot of junk out there and a lot of complexity and a lot of buzzwords, what's real? You know, what is AI that's actually relevant? And I think about it in kind of four big components. And David, I'd love your thoughts on this as well. But to me, very simply, it's about who's building it. You know, can you see the quality of the team that's putting that together? Explainability. It's, can you see how they came to that judgment, right? You never want a black box on this front. Of course, you want validated results, and you want to be able to see the numbers. And then finally, you want to see what third-party analysts have to say on it, people who have seen a lot of these and have that judgment. But David, I'm curious about your thoughts on this as well.
Well, quite honestly, I also look at AI with other capabilities and its other capabilities, which is to take anonymized data and to make it identifiable to an individual. And I think that's both a promise and a curse.
Yeah.
So in the context of managing secure information systems, you can look at de-identified social media data and take it and identify it to an individual within your organization who may be taking through a social media context, transferring confidential information, but doing so through a fictitious name or a Twitter handle. Yeah. But also the fact that organizations can take de-identified or aggregate data created by a healthcare organization and combine it with publicly available information through social media or other contexts and use it to identify an individual based on their healthcare characteristics. Yeah. So that's both the promise and the curse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, it's a double-edged sword, and you bring up that point very well. So just to wrap things up, you know, not specifically talking about Protenus here, but certainly for a brief moment, I'll be proud of the amazing system that our team has built. When it comes to AI and figuring out what is the most truly validated, effective system on the planet, there really aren't more accolades than you can get than Protenus. Independently, we've been validated by every third party that's looking at this challenge and really seen as the absolute best on this front. So I want to wrap up, though, with kind of what matters. What did we take away today? And I think it can be summarized in a few key slides. First, we see this large-scale shift from a more federally focused enforcement regime to a more state-based enforcement regime. Second, we see these trends of interoperability, both from a technologically driven as well as regulatorily driven perspective, as creating much more privacy risk. Third, we're seeing the increased chaos and unpredictability in many ways of the regulations that are coming out, as moving us from having the ability to make sure we get our checklist done to, frankly, having to think really about the risks holistically and tackle them in a way that we haven't necessarily had to before, but in a way that's very comprehensive and that helps us really focus those risks. And then finally, AI is here to stay. As David put it very eloquently, it's a double-edged sword, but we're going to have to deal with it. It creates a lot of risks, but simultaneously, as I hope we demonstrated earlier, it creates a lot of potential to help teams be more effective. It, of course, can't do everything. It's not Terminator. It's not that AI in that movie, Her. It doesn't have that human judgment, but it is capable of doing a lot that helps us focus on what's more important, those human judgment tasks that simply can't be done at scale that we want to do them at. We're about to jump into the questions, but I want to make sure that we have just a moment to talk about some of the resources that are available. We'll be distributing some information on this afterwards that comes from some book chapters that have been put together on this. As I mentioned earlier, you can sign up for the breach barometer. If you're interested from a return on investment standpoint, we can do an ROI analysis with your system. And then finally, CynergisTek has a terrific annual report that it put out on many of these topics that I think would be quite helpful. So we have just a few minutes left, but would love to tackle any questions that have come up.
Yeah, I think we have time for about 2 questions. Let's see here. The first one is, what are your recommendations for addressing increases in potential incidents arising from proactive monitoring? In addition to re-educating workforce, what have folks done to manage the cases given the limited resources for privacy investigations?
So I can take a first stab at that. One of the things that we see, there's a lot of different approaches to tackling the challenge of these increased violations, but one of the things that we see is that when you're leveraging more advanced healthcare compliance analytics technology, a lot of the time to actually get to resolution and the amount of grunt work that you have to do, so to speak, to get them done is significantly reduced. And so oftentimes, even opening the proverbial floodgates, you still are probably able to tackle that, sometimes yourself, sometimes with a trusted partner like CynergisTek to do that work, but it's often manageable on that front. Another thing that I would see is make sure that you have the ability with any system that you deploy on that front to actually toggle the risk level. You should be able to say, look, I only have this many FTEs or this much time to tackle this problem, so I'm going to titrate the risk score. I'm going to adjust the risk score to say, just give me the highest risk, the ones that I can handle, because that level of intelligence will allow you to focus in on what's most important.
And I don't want to miss the opportunity to point out that the greatest influencer of changing culture is training and awareness of those who access your system, not just your employees, but also your contractors, vendors, and in the healthcare space, your affiliated physicians. Mm-hmm. It's crucial to make sure that they're aware, number one, what their responsibilities are, number two, that you are auditing and monitoring, and what the impacts of that are.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question. Well, this came in at the beginning. Will the national credit bureaus be subject to the regulations?
Well, the national credit bureaus are already subject to some regulation under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It's not clear. Different states take a different approach as to whether or not credit bureaus are subject to their individual state data protection and privacy breach notification requirements. So I encourage you to take a look at your individual state's requirements and see if they exempt organizations that are subject to Graham-Leach Bliley.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for today. I would like to thank David and Robert so much for a great presentation, and thanks to everyone who took the time to join us. I hope you all have a great day, and this concludes our webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Shannon, and thanks, David, for being here.
And thank you again for inviting me.